In the cold afternoon light, a former Navy SEAL walks his German Shepherd through a quiet northern town. Under a flickering street lamp, they see an old man, one leg gone, sitting in a wheelchair surrounded by three young men laughing. The boys kick the wheelchair lightly, testing him,
What's the matter,
mocking
Grandpa?
him, enjoying how
Stand up for
powerless he
yourself.
looks. People pass by and look away.
Out here. Yeah,
No
hurry
one
up.
wants
Let's
trouble.
Go inside.
Silence becomes permission. The dog suddenly breaks formation, charging forward
Just stay
and
back,
standing
all right?
between the
We're
men
leaving.
and the old man. The soldier follows, not in anger, but because the warning has already been given. From the house across the street, the old man's daughter runs out, fixes her father's coat, wheels him away. Where are you watching from today? Like the video and subscribe to K9 Navy SEAL Legend. Nolan Cade had been in the lakeside town of Briar Glen for a few days. Long enough for the snow to stop feeling like an enemy. Long enough for the rhythm of quiet streets to start pressing against his nerves. Not long enough for anyone to know him. He kept it that way on purpose. At 28, Nolan looked like the kind of man people noticed and then quickly looked away from, as if their eyes had brushed something private. He stood around 6'1", shoulders broad, frame dense with the steady strength of someone who trained not to impress, but to endure. His face was clean-shaven, sharply American in its angles. Strong jaw, defined cheekbones, a chin that looked built for stubborn decisions. Dark brown hair sat in a crisp undercut, always clean, always controlled. The only thing on him that didn't obey control was the ache in his upper arm, a pale old scar that flared when the air turned sharp, like winter itself wanted to remind him of what he'd already survived. His eyes were blue-gray, deep-set, and watchful, less like a man sightseeing and more like a man taking measurements. He didn't smile much. When he did, it never reached the tired part of his gaze. He wore the same clothes every day, because changing them felt like admitting he planned to stay. A long-sleeved digital camouflage top fitted close to his body, matching camo pants with fabric that held its shape at the knees and thighs like it had been made for movement. A dark tactical belt wrapped his waist, holding a small pouch and a holster-shaped carrier that looked more like it belonged to tools than weapons. Tan combat boots rose high over his ankles, thick-soled and built for ice. A steel watch with a black face sat on his wrist. Quiet luxury, practical precision. Beside him walked Kestrel. The German Shepherd was a full-grown working K9, athletic, balanced, built with compact muscle that didn't waste motion. Black and tan fur lay short and thick against his body, healthy and weatherproof. His eyes were dark and intelligent, always scanning. Corners, windows, the way strangers carried their shoulders. Kestrel didn't wear a vest or flashy gear. No harness announcing him to the world. He moved like he didn't need permission to belong. Most dogs pulled toward excitement. Kestrel moved like a disciplined shadow, close enough to protect, far enough to observe. Every morning, Nolan walked the same loop. Down Maple Street, past the frozen edge of the lake where sunlight glittered on ice like broken glass. Then through the older neighborhood where cedar fences leaned with age and porches sat buried under clean white drifts. In Briar Glen, winter wasn't darkness. It was brightness. A clear, cold sun turned the whole town silver, made breath visible, made every sound feel sharper. People here greeted each other in quick, practiced ways. Everyone seemed to belong to someone. A family name, a church pew, a high school football memory. Nolan belonged to no one. He didn't ask questions. He didn't offer details. The motel clerk, an older man with a walrus mustache and wary eyes, had tried once. "Passing through?" he'd asked, friendly but curious. Nolan had nodded and kept his voice flat. For a few days, that was all the town got. The diner waitress, Lena, a petite woman in her 30s with a braid of auburn hair and freckles scattered across pale skin, noticed Nolan's habit of sitting with his back to the wall. She didn't comment. She just refilled his coffee without hovering, like she understood that some people came to small towns to hide inside them. Still, no matter how carefully Nolan tried to disappear, Kestrel kept interrupting the illusion. On the edge of the older neighborhood, near a green-painted street lamp with peeling metal, Kestrel slowed every time. Not in the distracted way of a dog catching a rabbit scent. This was controlled, deliberate. His ears angled forward. His nostrils flared. Then he froze, front paws planted, spine straight, eyes fixed on something Nolan couldn't see. The first time, Nolan told himself it was nothing. The second time, he memorized the angle of Kestrel's head, the direction of his gaze, the exact point in the street where the dog's body locked into stillness. By the third time, Nolan felt that old instinct tighten behind his ribs. The instinct he'd trained into a weapon and then tried to bury when he left the teams. He didn't like how quickly his mind started mapping possible threats. He didn't like how his pulse steadied instead of spiking, like his body had been waiting for a reason to become useful again. So he did what he'd taught himself to do in the years since. Keep walking. Until the afternoon, the town forced him to stop. The sky that day was clean and bright, the kind of winter afternoon that looked harmless. Nolan and Kestrel turned into the older neighborhood, boots crunching softly on hard-packed snow. The cold air made Nolan's scar ache in a dull, familiar way. Kestrel slowed. He froze, and this time Nolan heard voices. Not friendly ones. Under the street lamp, 3 young men clustered around a wheelchair. Their laughter carried sharp and brittle, less joy than appetite. One of them nudged the wheel with his boot, not hard enough to be called assault, just enough to rock the chair and make the old man inside it grip the armrests. The old man looked like winter had been chewing on him for years. He was thin, shoulders narrow under a worn coat that hung loose like it belonged to someone bigger. A knit cap flattened wisps of white hair against his scalp. His skin had that papery pallor of someone who spent too much time indoors because going outside cost too much strength. A blanket lay over his legs, and one pant leg ended empty, folded and pinned where a limb should have been. What made him look most vulnerable wasn't the missing leg. It was the way he kept his chin down, as if eye contact was an invitation to be hurt. "Come on, Grandpa," one of the young men said, voice dripping with mock sweetness. "You can't park your little ride wherever you want." Another laughed and reached toward the blanket. Maybe he's got spare change in there too. The third one stood a half step back, taller, more confident. He had a sharp face, faint stubble shadowing his jaw, and the kind of smile that stuck around too long. His eyes were bright with entitlement, the look of someone who'd rarely been forced to apologize. He watched the others like a director watching actors, enjoying the scene. Kestrel stepped forward without being told. No bark, no lunge. He simply placed his body between the wheelchair and the 3 men, shoulders squared, head level. A living barrier. His stillness returned, intentional, controlled, absolute. It wasn't aggression, it was warning. Nolan stopped behind him. He didn't rush, he didn't shout. He just arrived, quiet as a door closing. The boys glanced at Nolan's stance, at the tactical belt, at the way Nolan didn't scan them like a civilian. Nolan's presence carried a kind of calm that made people feel outmatched without understanding why. He spoke once. "Step back." His voice was low and even, but it carried. Not anger, Control. The kind that didn't need volume. One of the boys snorted, trying to claw back bravado. Or what? Kestrel's weight shifted forward by a fraction, paws still planted. His ears lifted. His eyes locked onto the boy's knees, measuring balance. Nolan could almost feel the dog's restraint like a physical thing. Disciplined, deliberate, dangerous because it wasn't chaotic. The taller one, sharp-faced, stubble, too confident smile, tilted his head. "Nice dog," he said, casual. "You passing through?" Nolan didn't answer. Answers were openings. He took one slow step closer. The boy who'd nudged the wheel glanced down at Kestrel and swallowed. The laughter drained out of the air as if someone had opened a window. The tall one's smile tightened. He lifted his hands, mock innocent. "Relax. We're just messing around." Nolan's gaze dropped to the old man's trembling fingers, then rose again. "Move." For a heartbeat, it looked like the tall one might test him just to prove he could. Then he let out a short breath and backed away. "Fine," he muttered, and the three of them drifted off down the street, boots kicking snow like they needed to punish something on the way out. Nolan didn't watch them leave. He watched corners and blind spots and the old man's breathing. When the street went quiet, Nolan crouched beside the wheelchair, keeping his movements slow. "You hurt?" he asked. The old man's voice came thin. "I'm fine." Pride dressed up as resilience. Nolan didn't challenge it. He adjusted the blanket where it had slipped, careful not to touch skin, careful not to make the man feel handled. Boundaries mattered. Respect mattered more. A door across the street banged open. A woman ran out fast enough to slip once on the icy step before catching herself. She was late 20s, slim but sturdy, built like someone who carried responsibility more often than she carried purses. Brown hair was pulled into a low ponytail beneath a knit beanie. Her skin was fair, flushed pink from the cold and the sprint. Hazel eyes flicked from her father to Nolan to the dog in one quick sweep. Mara Calder moved like someone who had learned to be gentle and ready to fight at the same time. "Dad," she breathed, dropping into a crouch in front of the wheelchair. Her hands hovered, afraid to touch bruises into existence. "Are you hurt? Did they—" The old man shook his head, stubborn. "I'm fine. I told you, I'm fine." Mara's gaze snapped toward the street where the boys had gone. Anger flashed across her face, hot and clean, then cooled into control. She stood and turned to Nolan. "Thank you," she said, the words tight but sincere. "You didn't have to do that." Nolan nodded once. Praise made him uncomfortable. It felt like a rope someone could pull. Kestrel watched Mara with calm focus. No friendliness, no hostility, just attention. Like he was reading her the way Nolan read rooms. Mara's eyes flicked to the dog. "He's trained." Nolan's voice stayed neutral. "He listens." Something softened in her expression, as if she understood the weight of that sentence. The old man finally lifted his gaze toward Nolan. Up close, there was more than frailty in his face. There was a quiet hardness in the set of his mouth. "Don't need saving," he muttered, almost like he needed to hear himself say it. Nolan met his eyes. "Didn't save you," he said. "Just stopped them." That landed differently. The old man's shoulders eased a fraction. Mara exhaled, then reached for the wheelchair handles. "Let's get you inside," she said to her father, voice gentler. To Nolan, she added, "We're okay. Really." Nolan stepped back, giving her space. He should have left. He wanted to leave. The plan was always leave. Walk on, disappear, return to the motel room, and the lie that solitude was peace. He turned away. Kestrel followed for 2 steps. Then the dog stopped. Hard stop. Kestrel's body went rigid again, eyes fixed, not on Mara, not on the wheelchair, but on the narrow alley between 2 houses, where shadows lay darker even under bright winter sun. The dog's ears angled forward. His breathing slowed. That stillness returned, more intense than before. Nolan's stomach tightened. He followed the line of Kestrel's gaze and saw only snow, fence slats, a trash bin half buried in white. Nothing moving, nothing obvious. But Kestrel wasn't looking at nothing. Mara, halfway up the walkway, glanced back. "Is something wrong?" Nolan kept his face blank. "No," he lied, because he didn't want to drag her into whatever this was. Kestrel didn't move. And for a flicker of time, an unwanted, vivid memory, Nolan saw a different dog years ago, in a different cold, freezing in place the same way. A warning Nolan had dismissed as probably nothing. The sound that followed that dismissal had been screaming metal and a civilian's blood on concrete. Nolan swallowed hard. His scar throbbed in the cold, like it agreed with the memory. He looked again at the alley. Still nothing. But Kestrel refused to take the next step. That refusal felt like a hand closing around Nolan's wrist. Nolan could have forced the leash, could have dragged Kestrel forward and told himself he was done with this. Instead, he did the one thing he hadn't done in years. He listened. Nolan didn't move. He didn't speak. He simply stood in the bright winter light and watched the shadows, letting the dog's stillness stretch the moment until it became unbearable. Then, barely audible, a soft scrape came from behind the fence. Not a footstep, not a voice. Something small shifting, as if someone had been there and decided to remain hidden. Kestrel's head tilted 1 degree, confirming it. Not supernatural, not magic. A presence. Nolan's pulse stayed calm, which scared him more than fear would have. He didn't want to be this man again. The man who noticed what others missed. The man whose body turned quiet before violence. He forced himself to breathe. "Inside," he said softly. Not to Mara, but to himself. Mara wheeled her father up the ramp, her posture tense now, as if she had felt the temperature change without knowing why. Everett muttered something about dogs being dramatic. But his voice lacked conviction. Nolan remained where he was, eyes steady on the alley. After several seconds, the scrape stopped. The silence returned. Too clean. Kestrel finally shifted his weight. But he didn't relax. He didn't look away. His whole body said the same thing without sound, not finished. Nolan turned his head just enough to see Mara at the doorway, one hand on the wheelchair handle, watching him with cautious confusion. She didn't know who he was. She didn't know what his stillness meant. Nolan didn't know her answers. But as he stood there, he realized something that sat cold and heavy in his chest. In a town this bright, cruelty didn't thrive unless someone was feeding it. And Kestrel, disciplined, silent, unshakably sure, had been telling Nolan all along that this corner of Briar Glen wasn't just a place they walked past. It was a warning. Nolan finally tugged the leash gently. "Come on," he murmured. Kestrel took 1 step, then paused, just long enough to look back at the alley one last time, as if memorizing it. Only then did he move. Nolan walked away with the sun glinting off the snow and the lake shining like glass in the distance. He should have felt relief. He should have felt done. Instead, he felt the first crack in the wall he'd built around himself. Because Kestrel had stopped, and Nolan had listened. And in that listening, Something old and dangerous had woken up. Something that didn't care what Nolan wanted, only what was right. Sometimes warning doesn't arrive like thunder. Sometimes it arrives as a dog who refuses to move. Nolan didn't sleep well. He lay on the stiff motel mattress with the heater clicking on and off like a nervous habit, staring at the ceiling until the darkness thinned into morning. Every time he closed his eyes, his mind tried to do what it had always done. Replay, analyze, correct. He didn't let it. He counted breaths instead. In through the nose, out through the mouth. Slow enough to keep his pulse from waking the old instincts that lived under his ribs. By dawn, the ache in his upper arm had settled into a dull throb, the kind that felt less like pain and more like a reminder. The snow outside the window glowed pale blue, clean and almost beautiful, as if the world were innocent. Nolan dressed in the same fixed uniform of his life. Digital camo top and matching pants, dark tactical belt with a pouch and a holster-like carrier for tools, tan boots, steel watch. He didn't do it because he lacked choices. He did it because consistency meant control, and control meant safety. Kestrel stood by the door, already alert. The German Shepherd's black and tan coat looked nearly lacquered in the early light. Short fur dense enough to shrug off cold. His eyes followed Nolan's movements with a steady, intelligent focus. Not affection, not obedience, partnership. The dog's posture was calm, but the tension in his shoulders said he'd been listening all night. Nolan clipped the leash on, and they stepped outside. Briar Glen in the morning was a postcard. Sunlight hit the snow so sharply it looked like the whole town had been dusted with glass. Chimney smoke rose in slow ribbons. A few cars rolled past, tires crunching on salted streets. People moved with the quiet purpose of routines they trusted. Nolan walked the long way toward the older neighborhood. Not to help, to check. He told himself it was simple. Bullies escalated when they knew no one was watching. He'd seen it in cities and deserts and places where the law was a rumor. Small towns had their own versions, gentler faces, the same logic. If he didn't confirm what he'd felt yesterday, the corner of his mind would keep scraping at it until he bled. He turned onto the street with the green-painted street lamp. The air smelled faintly of pine and something darker underneath. Wet wood, old metal, the buried scent of work. Kestrel's gait tightened. Not a stop, just a subtle narrowing of focus. His ears angled forward. Nolan followed his line of attention to the row of houses and the small porch across the street. Mara's house. The ramp leading up to the front door was dusted with a thin layer of snow, but the tracks on it were fresh, wheelchair tires, boot prints beside them. Nothing unusual, nothing alarming, just proof of life. Nolan approached slowly, not wanting to appear like a stranger who lingered. He stopped at the edge of the walkway and kept his hands visible, posture neutral. Kestrel stood at his left, steady, eyes scanning. The front door opened before Nolan could decide whether to knock. Mara Calder stepped out with a mug in her hand, steam rising into the cold. In daylight, she looked younger than Nolan had assumed, maybe late 20s. But the set of her shoulders made her seem older. She was slim, not fragile. Lean strength, like someone who lifted groceries with one hand while holding a life together with the other. Her brown hair was pulled into a low ponytail, wisps escaping around her ears. Her skin was fair, cheeks pink from the cold. Hazel eyes, sharp, awake, fixed on Nolan without flinching. She didn't smile. She didn't accuse. She simply watched him the way people watched unfamiliar weather. "You're back?" she said. Nolan nodded once. "Just making sure." Mara's gaze flicked to Kestrel, then back to Nolan. My dad's inside. I'm not here to, Nolan started. Help? Mara supplied, blunt but not cruel. Yeah, I figured. The honesty in her voice hit Nolan harder than hostility would. Have. He had expected suspicion. Suspicion was comfortable. It was the language he spoke. Mara stepped aside anyway. Come in for a minute. It's cold. Nolan hesitated. Going inside meant stepping into someone else's life, and he had trained himself not to do that. But leaving would look worse. Like he was a man who showed up once for a dramatic moment and vanished. He followed her inside. The house smelled like clean laundry and old wood. Warm air wrapped around Nolan, carrying faint notes of coffee and something medicinal, menthol or muscle rub. The living room was modest, carefully kept. A stack of books on a side table, a worn recliner angled toward a window that caught morning light. Practical, not decorative. Everett sat in the recliner with a blanket over his lap, wheelchair parked nearby. In daylight, he looked even thinner than he had outside. His face was deeply lined, not from age alone, but from restraint. Years of swallowing words. White hair stuck out under a knit cap like he'd fought with it and lost. His eyes were pale and tired, but not empty. He looked at Nolan like a man assessing a tool someone left on his porch. So, Everett said, voice rough, you came back to make sure the old cripple didn't get eaten by wolves. Mara shot him a warning look. Dad? Everett lifted a hand, stubborn. I'm not rude, I'm accurate. Nolan didn't take offense. He'd heard worse. He'd been worse. I came back because people like that don't stop, Nolan said. They test, then they push. Everett's mouth tightened. They've been testing for a long time. There was something in the way he said it. Like the harassment had history. Like it had roots. Mara set her mug down and leaned lightly against the counter, arms crossed. You don't live here, she said to Nolan, calm but firm. So you should know what you're walking into. Nolan met her gaze. I'm not walking into anything. Mara's eye didn't soften. That's what everyone thinks. Until they're inside. Everett let out a dry laugh that turned into a cough. When he recovered, he looked at Nolan again, and the pride in him rose like a shield. Don't make me your good deed, Everett said. Don't turn me into the reason you get to feel decent about yourself. The words were direct, almost rude, but there was a tremor underneath. Fear disguised as dignity. Nolan recognized it. He'd worn the same disguise. He nodded once. Fair. For a moment the room went quiet, only the ticking of a small clock and the faint sound of wind against the windows. Nolan's mind kept trying to name the feeling behind his ribs. It wasn't guilt. It wasn't duty. It was something like recognition. Kestrel moved without sound across the living room and sat, eyes tracking Everett. Not hostile, not affectionate, focused, as if the dog was listening to Everett's heartbeat and memorizing its rhythm. Everett noticed. He eyed the shepherd warily. That dog always stare like that? He notices things, Nolan said. Everett snorted. So do I. Didn't help me much. Mara's jaw tightened. Nolan saw the fatigue behind her control. She had been holding her father's life upright for a long time, and it showed not in weakness, but in the way her patience had edges. I'm Mara, she said abruptly. Perhaps deciding if Nolan was going to be in the room, he should at least have names. You already know my dad. Nolan gave a small nod. Nolan. He didn't offer more. No last name, no history. That boundary mattered. Mara didn't push. She just watched him with the wary intelligence of someone who had learned that strangers with calm voices could still be dangerous. Everett shifted in the recliner, the movement careful. Nolan's eyes flicked to the wheelchair, its right wheel slightly misaligned, the handrim scuffed. A cheap model that had been repaired more times than it should have survived. "Your wheel's pulling," Nolan said. Everett's brows lifted. "You a mechanic now, too?" Nolan crouched beside the chair without waiting for permission, but he kept his hands open, slow. "No, I just notice." He tested the wheel gently, feeling the wobble. A loose bolt. Not catastrophic, but enough to make winter sidewalks more dangerous than they already were. Mara watched, surprised. "We've been trying to get it fixed. The clinic's booked out. The repair shop charges too much," Everett finished, bitter. Nolan didn't respond to the bitterness. He reached to his belt pouch and pulled out a compact multi-tool. The movement was practiced, efficient. Mara's gaze sharpened. "You carry that just walking around?" Nolan didn't look up. "Habit." He tightened the bolt, realigned the wheel, tested it again. The wobble eased. Everett stared at the chair like it had betrayed him. Then he looked at Nolan, something cautious shifting in his eyes. "You do that for everyone you pass on the street?" Everett asked. Nolan paused. The honest answer was no. The honest answer was he avoided everyone. "I don't," Nolan said. Everett's mouth tightened, pride refusing to dissolve. "Then don't start." Nolan stood, hands slipping into his pockets to keep from fidgeting. "I'm not starting, I'm just correcting something that's off." That line sounded like it belonged to more than a wheelchair. It sounded like it belonged to Nolan's whole life. Mara exhaled slowly, as if she'd been holding her breath since Nolan walked in. "Look," she said, voice quieter. "This town, it has rules. Not written ones, but rules. If someone like Rye..." She stopped herself, eyes flicking to her father. "If those guys decide you're a problem, they don't come at you straight. They make you look like the problem." Nolan heard the warning, and something in him chilled despite the warmth of the house. He'd seen that tactic. It was cleaner than violence, harder to fight. Everett's gaze went distant, fixed on a spot near the window. When he spoke, his voice dropped. "Years ago," he said, "I used to work down by the old marina. Repairs, wood, metal, whatever folks needed. I wasn't rich, but I had hands that worked." Mara's shoulders lowered slightly, as if this story was a bruise she had learned not to press. Everett continued, eyes still distant. "Then that new dock project started. Big talk, big money, big promises." His fingers curled on the blanket. "I saw things I wasn't supposed to see. Materials coming in that didn't match what was paid for. Boards that felt too light. Bolts that weren't rated for the load." Nolan stayed silent, letting Everett choose the pace. The old man's pride made confession feel like loss. "I said something," Everett added, bitterness creeping in. "Not loudly. Not to the newspaper, just I signed a statement when they asked. Thought that's what decent people did." Mara looked away, jaw clenched. Everett's eyes returned to Nolan. "Decent people forget you real fast when money gets nervous." Nolan felt the room tighten, the air thickening with old resentment and quiet fear. Kestrel, who had been still, rose and walked toward the back of the house, toward a hallway that led to the kitchen and what Nolan guessed was a back door. The dog's nose lowered, nostrils flaring. His tail stayed neutral, not tucked, not wagging, working mode. Mara noticed. "He usually does that?" Nolan's answer came slowly. Only when something doesn't belong. Nolan followed Kestrel through the kitchen. A small window looked out onto a narrow backyard and a weathered shed. The shed was old. Gray wood, patched roof, padlock rusted. Snow drifted against its base. Kestrel stopped at the back door and stared at the shed. Nolan's skin prickled. He opened the door and stepped onto the back porch. The cold bit immediately, sharp enough to sting his lungs. Kestrel moved down the steps and walked toward the shed, paws silent on snow. He stopped a few feet from the door and froze, head angled slightly to the side. Nolan inhaled. A faint smell drifted on the air. Chemical, metallic, like solvent, like fuel. Not strong enough to overwhelm, strong enough to notice if you were trained to notice. Nolan's mind tried to categorize it. His pulse stayed calm, which made him uneasy. Calm meant his body thought it knew what this was. Mara stepped out behind him, arms wrapped around herself against the cold. "That shed's been here forever," she said. "Just junk and old tools." Everett's voice came from the doorway, sharp. "Mara, get inside." She didn't move. "Dad, inside," Everett repeated. And this time the command carried more fear than pride. Nolan glanced back. Everett stood in the doorway, one hand gripping the frame. His face had gone pale. The tough old man, who refused pity, suddenly looked like someone hearing footsteps he remembered too well. And Nolan understood. Whatever was happening now had been happening before. Rehook, mid-chapter. Kestrel lowered his head and pressed his nose to the snow near the shed, then snapped his gaze up, straight to the fence line. Not the shed door, not the padlock, the fence. Nolan followed the dog's focus and saw, half buried under powder, a clean indentation, like something round and heavy had been set down recently. Too regular to be a rock, too deliberate to be nature. Kestrel didn't bark. He didn't paw at it. He simply stood over the spot, frozen, eyes unblinking, as if saying, "Here, this matters." Mara's breath hitched. "What is that?" Nolan didn't answer because he didn't know yet. But in his chest, something old and unwelcome stirred. The feeling of a pattern emerging. He crouched, brushed the snow aside carefully with a gloved hand. The outline became clearer. A circular mark, maybe from a small container. And beside it, faint scuffs that looked like someone had dragged something away. Everett's voice from the doorway trembled, just slightly. "They're not just messing with me," he said. They're making sure I remember." The words landed like cold metal. Nolan stood slowly, eyes scanning the fence line, the neighboring yards, the blind angles behind the shed. Briar Glen still looked bright, still looked harmless. But Nolan felt the truth under it. Soft power, quiet cruelty, and a fear that had been cultivated over years. He turned to Mara. "Has anyone been back here? Besides you?" Mara swallowed. "No. I would have seen tracks." Nolan glanced at the snow. The backyard was sheltered. Wind could blur prints, time could erase them. But Kestrel's body language was clear. Something had been here recently, and it didn't belong. Nolan walked closer to the fence, boots crunching softly. He didn't touch it. He just looked at the top rail, at the posts, at where snow piled unevenly. He found a faint scrape on one wooden slat, fresh enough to catch light differently. Someone had leaned there, watched, maybe listened. Nolan stepped back, forcing himself not to react like this was a mission. It wasn't. There were no orders, no team, no radio, just choices. He turned to Everett in the doorway. "Do you have any proof of what you signed years ago?" Everett's mouth tightened. Paperwork, somewhere. Doesn't matter. Nobody cared then. It matters now, Nolan said, surprised by how certain his voice sounded. Everett's eyes narrowed. Why? Nolan's throat tightened. He could have lied. Could have said, because it's right. But Everett had already warned him about good deeds and ego. So Nolan gave the only honest answer he trusted. Because if they're back here, Nolan said, nodding toward the shed and the fence line, they're not doing it for fun. Mara looked at Nolan, fear and hope warring in her hazel eyes. So what do we do? Nolan's mind ran through options like a checklist. Call the police. With what evidence? Confront the boys? Escalate into a story that made Everett and Mara targets? Leave? And know what would happen when no one watched? He exhaled slowly. First, Nolan said, you go inside, both of you. Lock the back door. Mara hesitated, pride flaring. I'm not... Everett cut her off. Mara, inside. She obeyed, but her gaze lingered on Nolan, searching for a promise he didn't know how to give. Nolan stayed in the yard a moment longer with Kestrel. The dog stood beside him, steady, eyes still on the fence line. The chemical metal scent hung faintly in the cold. Nolan clipped the leash shorter, not to restrain Kestrel, but to keep them connected. We're not here to be heroes, Nolan murmured, more to himself than the dog. Kestrel didn't react. He simply looked up at Nolan once, eyes dark and unwavering, then returned his attention to the fence, as if reminding Nolan that this wasn't about heroics. It was about listening before it was too late. Nolan turned and walked back toward the porch. He didn't tell Mara and Everett he'd be back. He didn't want to make promises he couldn't control. But as he stepped inside and the warmth hit his face, Nolan realized a simple, uncomfortable truth. He hadn't returned to check on a corner of town. He had returned because something in him recognized the shape of fear in Everett Calder. And because Kestrel, silent, disciplined, unshakably sure, was pointing at a story that had been buried for years and was now pressing back up through the snow. The harassment didn't return with laughter. It returned with precision. Nolan noticed it first in the sound, a sharp crack in the early evening, like ice snapping under weight. Then another. Not loud enough to draw a crowd, loud enough to be heard by the people it was meant for. Glass. By the time Nolan reached Everett Calder's house, the street was already quiet again. Briar Glen had that way of swallowing disturbances whole. No sirens, no witnesses lingering at windows. Just snow settling back into place, pretending nothing had happened. The front window was shattered, not completely destroyed. Just one clean hole punched through the lower corner, spiderweb cracks radiating outward. A rock lay on the rug inside, wet with melting snow. The placement wasn't random. Whoever threw it knew exactly where to aim to make the point without causing immediate danger. Fear, not chaos. Mara stood frozen in the doorway, arms wrapped tight around herself. Her face had gone pale beneath the porch light, hazel eyes fixed on the broken glass as if it might move again. She looked smaller than she had before, not weaker, but suddenly aware of how thin the walls really were. Everett sat in his wheelchair behind her, jaw locked so tightly the muscles twitched. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Nolan crouched beside the window frame, gloved fingers hovering just above the cracked glass. He didn't touch it yet. He let his eyes do the work. "Anyone hurt?" he asked. Mara shook her head. "No, they didn't even ring the bell." "That's the point," Nolan said quietly. He stepped outside and studied the snow beneath the window. The rock had come from the street side, not the yard. Nolan traced the angle in his head, calculating distance, trajectory, height. His eyes followed the faint scuff marks where boots had shifted for leverage. 3 sets of prints, same pattern as before. Kestrel stood a few feet away, body still but alert, nose lifted to the air. The dog's ears angled slightly east, catching scent carried by the breeze. Nolan followed that line of attention to the far end of the street, where the road curved toward the marina. Nolan noted the wind direction, north-northeast. Light, enough to carry aerosol. "Stay inside," he said to Mara. "Both of you." Mara bristled. "We can't just—" Nolan looked at her, not unkindly, but with a seriousness that made her stop. "This isn't about the window." She swallowed and stepped back, pulling the door closed. Nolan stayed outside a moment longer, letting the cold bite his face. He wasn't angry. Anger was sloppy. He felt something colder, more dangerous. A familiar narrowing of focus. They were escalating, and they were doing it carefully. The next morning brought color. Red, white, and blue paint streaked across the wooden ramp leading up to Everett's front door. Thick lines, uneven but deliberate, sprayed in long arcs that soaked into the grain. The wheelchair ramp, Everett's only clean way in and out, had been turned into a message, not graffiti for fun, a statement. Mara stood at the edge of the porch, fists clenched, breathing fast. The paint fumes hung sharp in the air, stinging the back of Nolan's throat. He crouched and ran a finger along the edge of one streak, not touching, just close enough to smell it. Oil-based spray, cheap, fast-drying. He checked his watch. Early morning, cold enough to slow the cure, but not stop it. The timing told him more than the paint did. "They came back after midnight," Nolan said, "when the temperature dipped." Everett's voice was flat. "So it would stick?" "Yes." Everett looked at the ramp like it had betrayed him. "They want me trapped." Mara's anger finally broke through her control. "This is harassment. This is vandalism. We should call the police." Nolan didn't say no. He also didn't say yes. "Calling them isn't wrong," he said carefully. "But understand this. Without witnesses, without patterns, this becomes noise, and noise gets dismissed." Mara stared at him. "So what are you saying?" Nolan straightened, eyes moving to the street, the neighboring houses, the spaces between. "I'm saying they want you to react the way that helps them." Everett let out a short, humorless laugh. "They've always been good at that." The words hung heavy. Inside the house, Nolan helped Mara lay plastic over the ramp to keep the paint from spreading. He worked quietly, efficiently, the way he did everything. Mara watched him from the doorway, studying the set of his shoulders, the way he moved without wasted effort. "You don't act like a tourist," she said finally. Nolan didn't answer. Everett broke the silence instead. "You were military." It wasn't a question. Nolan paused just long enough to acknowledge the truth without feeding it. "Once." Everett nodded slowly. "Figures. You look like someone who learned early that fists don't fix what fear breaks." That landed closer to Nolan than Everett could have known. By afternoon, the message escalated again. This time it wasn't visible from the street. Nolan followed Kestrel around the side of the house toward the shed, the dog's movements growing more deliberate with each step. The snow here was less disturbed, drifted higher against the fence line. Nolan scanned the ground, then the walls. He saw it. A thin wire, nearly invisible against the gray wood, stretched low across the narrow path leading to the shed door. It was anchored to a rusted nail on one side and a bent hinge on the other, placed at ankle height. Not lethal, but enough to send someone in a wheelchair crashing forward. A trap. Nolan's jaw tightened. He knelt and clipped the wire with a clean, controlled motion. Kestrel didn't move, eyes fixed on the fence line as if expecting someone to step out and claim credit. No one did. Nolan straightened slowly, breath even. This wasn't random vandalism. It wasn't bored kids with spray paint. This was targeted intimidation. Everett watched from the back porch, face drained of color. "They're patient," he said. "That's what scares me." Nolan turned to him. "They're counting on you being predictable." Everett laughed softly. "At my age, that's all anyone expects." The confession came later, after the sun dipped low and the house settled into uneasy quiet. Everett sat at the kitchen table, hands wrapped around a mug that had gone cold. Mara stood nearby, arms folded, as if bracing herself for what she already knew was coming. "There's something I didn't tell you yesterday," Everett said, voice rough. Nolan didn't interrupt. "Years back when that marina project was underway, I wasn't just a bystander," Everett continued. "I signed off on an inspection report, materials, load ratings. Nothing dramatic, just a signature." He swallowed. "But it wasn't right. And I knew it." Mara closed her eyes. "I flagged it," Everett said. "Quietly. Thought it would be handled. Instead, it disappeared. And so did my contracts. Friends stopped calling. Then the accident happened." His hand drifted unconsciously toward the empty space beneath the table where his legs should have been. "After that," he said, "no one wanted me asking questions." Nolan listened, the pieces aligning into a shape he didn't like. "You cost someone money." Everett nodded once. "Enough to remember me, not enough to fear me." Silence filled the kitchen. Kestrel lay near Nolan's feet, head up, eyes open. The dog's calm presence anchored the room, kept it from tipping into despair. Mara finally looked at Nolan. "Who are those guys?" Nolan shook his head. "They're not the point. They're tools." Mara's voice dropped. "Then who's holding them?" Nolan didn't answer because he didn't have proof yet. Was hooked mid-chapter. That night, as Nolan walked the perimeter one last time before leaving, Kestrel stopped near the shed again. But this time he didn't freeze. He backed up, slowly, ears flat, body low. A warning Nolan hadn't seen from him before. Nolan followed the dog's gaze to the roofline of the shed. At first he saw nothing, just snow uneven and thick. Then he noticed the sag, subtle, new. Someone had been up there. Nolan climbed carefully, boots finding purchase on the edge. He brushed snow aside and found a darkened patch near the vent. Soot, faint but unmistakable. And beneath it, the smell of accelerant. Barely there, but real. Not spilled. Tested. Nolan climbed down, heart steady, but heavy. This wasn't harassment anymore. It was preparation. He said nothing to Mara and Everett. Not yet. Panic would help no one. He simply advised them to keep the back lights on and avoid the shed entirely. They agreed, reluctantly. Later that night, Nolan returned to the motel, exhaustion pulling at his bones. He sat on the edge of the bed and stared at his boots, still dusted with snow. He hadn't hit anyone, hadn't threatened anyone, hadn't called in favors or worn his past like armor. And still, the danger had grown. That was the cost of restraint. Kestrel lay down beside him, head resting on his paws, eyes open. Nolan exhaled slowly. This wasn't over. It was just beginning. And somewhere in the quiet, careful cruelty of Briar Glen, someone had decided Everett Calder was a problem that needed to be erased. The fire did not announce itself with sirens. It announced itself with heat. Nolan woke to Kestrel's weight shifting off the motel floor. A low sound rising from the dog's chest, not a growl, not a bark, but something sharp enough to slice through sleep. Nolan was upright before his mind caught up, boots halfway on, jacket in his hand. Smoke. Even from 3 blocks away, he could smell it. By the time Nolan reached Everett Calder's house, the shed behind it was already coughing flame into the winter night. Orange light licked at the snow, turning it black and wet. The cold cracked and hissed as heat met ice. Neighbors stood at a distance, silhouettes under porch lights, frozen between concern and relief that the fire wasn't theirs. Mara's scream cut through the noise. "Dad!" Everett was still inside. Nolan didn't think. He moved. Smoke rolled thick through the back of the house, low and fast. Nolan dropped his center of gravity instinctively, pulling his sleeve over his mouth as he pushed through the kitchen toward the living room. His lungs burned. His eyes watered, but his focus narrowed to one thing: Everett. The old man sat slumped in his wheelchair near the hallway, coughing hard enough to shake his frame. His face was gray, eyes watering, one hand clawing weakly at the armrest. Nolan was beside him in seconds. "Hey," Nolan said, voice firm, close to Everett's ear. "Stay with me." He released the wheelchair brakes with one motion, pivoted, and began hauling Everett backward through the smoke. The chair snagged on the edge of a rug. Nolan shoved it aside with his boot and kept moving. Behind him, Kestrel's presence flashed into the room, black and tan cutting through gray, eyes bright, body tense. The dog let out a single bark. One, sharp, commanding. It echoed down the street, cutting through the bystanders' silence like a blade. Heads turned. Doors opened wider. Someone shouted for water. Someone else yelled that they were calling the fire department. The bark did exactly what it was meant to do. Nolan dragged Everett out into the cold air just as flames burst fully through the shed roof behind them. Everett collapsed forward, coughing violently, hands gripping Nolan's sleeve with surprising strength. Mara dropped to her knees beside them, sobbing, one hand on her father's shoulder, the other shaking as she tried to call his name. "I've got you," Nolan said, steady. "You're out. Breathe." He stayed there until Everett's coughing slowed, until color crept back into the old man's face. Only then did Nolan step back, chest heaving, eyes tracking the fire's spread with a professional calm that felt out of place in a quiet town. Firefighters arrived late. Too late to save the shed. The flames ate it clean. By morning, Briar Glen had decided what the fire meant. Rumors moved faster than smoke ever had. At the diner, voices dropped when Everett's name came up. Someone mentioned insurance. Someone else mentioned attention. No one said the word arson out loud. It was easier to believe the fire had been an accident, or worse, a choice, than to believe something ugly lived among them. Mara heard it in line at the pharmacy. Everett heard it in the pauses when neighbors spoke to him too carefully. Nolan heard it everywhere. He didn't argue with the rumors. He understood them too well. Fear needed a story that didn't demand courage. Instead, Nolan worked. He rebuilt the wheelchair ramp with quiet efficiency, replacing burned boards, sanding edges smooth so Everett's hands wouldn't catch splinters. He drove Everett to the clinic to get his lungs checked, waited without complaint in stiff plastic chairs while doctors ran tests. He carried groceries without making a show of it. He spoke when spoken to. No more. Mara watched all of it. She noticed the way Nolan never touched her father without asking, never leaned in with false softness. He spoke to Everett like a man, not a patient. When Everett snapped, Nolan didn't snap back. He simply waited, like he knew time would do the work. "You don't treat him like he's fragile," Mara said one evening, as Nolan tightened the final bolt on the ramp. Nolan didn't look up. He's not. That answer stayed with her. Kestrel, meanwhile, had not relaxed since the fire. The German shepherd moved through the days with heightened vigilance, ears constantly swiveling, nose lifting at the smallest changes in the air. He paced the yard at dawn and dusk, tracing invisible lines only he could read. When Nolan clipped the leash on, Kestrel pulled, not hard but with intent, always in the same direction, toward the old marina. The docks there had been abandoned for years, half-rotted planks jutting into the frozen water like broken teeth. Officially, the place was condemned. Unofficially, people still passed through, fishermen, teenagers, men who didn't want to be seen. Nolan followed Kestrel one gray afternoon, boots crunching over gravel and ice. The air smelled of cold metal and lake water. As they approached the marina, Kestrel slowed, then angled his body toward a cluster of storage containers stacked near the shore. Nolan saw it too. Fresh tire marks, narrow, heavy load. He crouched, fingers hovering over the impression in the frost. A truck had been here recently, not municipal, not a delivery. Inside one of the containers, Nolan found charred residue in a metal tray, burn patterns that didn't belong to campfires or trash. He photographed it with his phone, careful about angles, careful about light. Evidence mattered. He'd learned that the hard way. The smell hit him next. Solvent, faint, but unmistakable. The same smell. Behind him, Kestrel stood perfectly still, eyes fixed on the waterline. Nolan straightened slowly. Someone hadn't just tested fire. They'd practiced. The next day, a patrol car rolled quietly into Everett's driveway. Deputy Aaron Mills stepped out. Mills was mid-40s, tall but soft around the edges, with a tired face and a neatly trimmed beard already threaded with gray. His uniform was clean but worn, the kind of wear that came from long shifts rather than action. His eyes were cautious, intelligent, and burdened with restraint. He shook Nolan's hand politely, grip firm but not challenging. "I hear you pulled Mr. Calder out," Mills said. Nolan nodded. "I was close." Mills glanced at Kestrel. "Dog barked?" "Once." Mills exhaled. "Town's still talking about that." Inside the house, Mills took notes slowly, methodically. He asked Everett questions without rushing, listened without interrupting. When Everett finished, Mills set his pen down. "I'm not saying this wasn't intentional," Mills said carefully. "But right now, I need proof that stands up clean. No maybes, no assumptions." Mara's voice cracked. "So, what? This just keeps happening?" Mills met her eyes. "I'm saying my hands are tied unless something solid shows up." Nolan understood the tone. Mills wasn't corrupt. He was constrained. After Mills left, Everett sat in silence for a long time. Then he spoke. "They're not going to stop," Everett said. His voice wasn't afraid anymore. It was resolved. "Because they think I'll fold. That I'll stay quiet like before." Mara turned sharply. "Dad," Everett raised a hand. "I already stayed quiet once. It cost me my leg. It cost me my life here." He looked at Nolan. "I still have the paperwork, copies, old signatures. I kept them because part of me knew this day might come." Nolan didn't rush him. "If you bring it forward," Nolan said, "it won't be quiet." Everett nodded. "I know." Mara's eyes filled. "You could get hurt." Everett's mouth curved into a thin, stubborn smile. "I already did." Kestrel rose and walked to Everett's side, resting his head lightly against the old man's knee. Everett startled, then relaxed, one hand dropping to the dog's head. The contact grounded him. Nolan watched the scene, something tightening in his chest. This wasn't his fight, but it was becoming his responsibility. That night, as Nolan stood outside under a sky heavy with clouds, Kestrel looked up at him, eyes dark and steady, no alarm, no urgency, just certainty. Nolan exhaled slowly. The fire had burned away more than wood. It had burned away the last excuse to stay silent. Everett Calder signed his name with a steady hand. The paper rested on the kitchen table, held down at the corners by mugs and old habits. The signature wasn't dramatic. No shaking pause. No speech before the pen touched the page. Just a man writing his own name as if he had done it 1,000 times before, because he had, in different ways, across different losses. Nolan stood a few steps back, hands in his pockets, eyes lowered. This wasn't his moment. He understood that instinctively. Everett didn't do it for Nolan. He did it because there was still something left that belonged to him. "I won't spend what time I have pretending I don't remember," Everett said quietly when the pen stopped moving. "That's how they win." Mara watched her father from the counter, arms crossed tightly around herself. She looked pale, dark circles under her eyes from nights without sleep. Her brown hair hung loose today, unbrushed, framing a face that had aged a year in a week. Pride and fear warred behind her hazel eyes. "This will make things worse," she said. Everett nodded. Yes, that was all. The consequences arrived before the ink had time to dry. It didn't come as fists or flames. It came as paperwork. Nolan was served a notice that afternoon at the motel. A polite man from the town council, thin, balding, uncomfortable in his own coat, stood at a careful distance while he spoke. He avoided eye contact, voice clipped and rehearsed. There had been complaints, concerns, accusations. Nolan Cade was alleged to have threatened local residents, to have interfered in a private dispute, to have entered restricted property near the marina without authorization. Nothing that would stick in a court of law, enough to push him out. "For now," the man added, like an apology. Nolan took the paper without comment. He'd seen this tactic before. Use the system not to punish, but to exhaust, to isolate, to make the truth inconvenient. By evening, word had spread. Mara lost her part-time job at the hardware store. No explanation. Just a quiet apology from her manager, eyes downcast, hands fidgeting. Everett stopped receiving calls from neighbors who used to check in just to be nice. The town didn't turn on them loudly. It turned away. Nolan packed his bag in silence. He folded his clothes the same way he always did. Movements precise, controlled. Kestrel watched from the corner of the room, body still, eyes following Nolan with that steady intelligence that never mistook routine for indifference. When Nolan walked back to Everett's house to say goodbye, the sun was already dipping low, casting long blue shadows across the snow. Mara opened the door before he knocked. "They're saying you're dangerous," she said flatly. Nolan nodded. "I know. They're saying you scared people." "I did," Nolan said. "Just not the ones they're talking about." Her lips pressed together. "I'm sorry." Nolan shook his head. "Don't be." Everett sat by the window, watching the street like it might blink first. He didn't look surprised when Nolan stepped inside. "So," Everett said, "they ran you off." "Temporarily," Nolan replied. Everett snorted. "That's how it always starts." Silence settled between them, not awkward, just heavy, the weight of things said and unsaid. "I didn't do this for you," Everett said suddenly. Nolan met his gaze. "I know." Everett studied him, eyes sharp despite the years. "You could have walked away clean. You chose not to." Nolan didn't answer because the truth was complicated. He left before dusk fully settled. He didn't linger. Lingering turned into promises. Outside, Kestrel paused at the edge of the driveway, ears lifting, gaze fixed down the street as if counting distances. Nolan clipped the leash shorter, not to restrain him, but to remind himself they were still moving together. They drove out of Briar Glen under a sky thick with clouds. The road unwound quietly, tires humming over asphalt dusted with salt. Nolan's thoughts stayed disciplined at first. Lists, contingencies, options. Where to go, how long to stay gone, who might still be watching. Then the memory broke through. It always came the same way. Sand, heat, the sound of metal under stress. Years ago, in another place that had pretended to be quiet, Nolan had walked point with a different dog at his side. A younger German shepherd, lighter frame, faster reactions. The dog had slowed that day, froze, head angled just slightly wrong. Nolan had noticed, and then dismissed it. Probably debris, he'd thought. Probably nothing. The blast that followed wasn't large enough to kill him, just large enough to shatter glass and throw a civilian to the ground with shrapnel tearing through his leg. The man had screamed, not in pain at first, but in disbelief. Nolan remembered standing there afterward, ears ringing, staring at the dog like it had betrayed him. The truth was harder. He had betrayed the warning. The memory tightened his chest now, even years later, even miles away. Nolan's grip on the steering wheel tightened until his knuckles went white. Kestrel lifted his head and looked at him, sensing the shift. The dog's expression wasn't concern in a human way. It was presence, a reminder. They stopped at a turnout overlooking the lake as night fell. The water lay dark and still beneath the clouds, a mirror that refused to reflect anything clearly. Nolan stepped out into the cold and breathed deeply. He didn't check his phone, didn't replay the accusations, didn't curse the town. Instead, he watched Kestrel. The dog stood facing the road back toward Briar Glen, body angled forward, ears high. He wasn't tense. He was waiting. Nolan followed Kestrel's gaze and felt it then. Not fear, not urgency, but something heavier, unfinished. Kestrel took one step toward the road, then stopped, looking back at Nolan as if asking a question. Not are we in danger, but are you ready? The moment stretched. Nolan realized something with quiet clarity. Leaving hadn't ended anything. It had only removed him from the board, and boards could be re-entered. He knelt and rested his forehead briefly against Kestrel's, a rare gesture he didn't allow himself often. The dog stayed still, accepting it. This time, Nolan murmured, barely audible, I won't ignore you. They didn't turn back that night. Nolan understood restraint as well as escalation. Charging in now would only confirm the story being told about him. He needed distance, perspective, proof that didn't smell like anger. They drove on, stopping at a small town an hour south. Nolan took a room under a different name. Old habits, useful ones. Over the next days, Nolan didn't sleep much. He reviewed everything he'd seen, the ramp, the trap, the shed, the marina. He cross-referenced public records on his phone, traced the history of the dock project Everett had mentioned. Names surfaced. Companies dissolved and reformed. Patterns emerged slowly, reluctantly. Kestrel stayed alert the entire time, resting only when Nolan rested, waking at the slightest sound. The dog wasn't anxious. He was patient, like he knew something Nolan didn't yet. On the fourth night, Nolan stood by the window, looking at his reflection in the glass. He looked older than he had a week ago. Not from stress, but from clarity. He had failed tactically in Briar Glen. He had succeeded morally, and the price of that success had been exile. But exile had its uses. Nolan packed his bag again, movement sufficient. This time, the direction he planned to go wasn't away from the problem. It was around it. Kestrel rose the moment Nolan reached for the leash, eyes bright, posture ready. Not eager, certain. Nolan exhaled slowly, letting the weight of his decision settle. This wasn't about saving Everett. It wasn't about clearing his own name. It was about finishing something he'd once left unfinished, about listening when the warning came and acting before the cost was paid by someone who didn't deserve it. They left before dawn, moving quietly, deliberately, like men who had accepted that the easy path was no longer available. And this time, Nolan wasn't running from Briar Glen. He was choosing the long way back. Everett Calder had always believed that danger announced itself. It came loud, or angry, or obvious, like storms rolling in over the lake, or men who shouted before they swung. So when the phone rang that afternoon, and the voice on the other end spoke calmly, reasonably, almost kindly, Everett didn't hear the warning he should have. "We just want to settle this," the man said. "No lawyers, no more noise. Come down to the old maintenance lot by the marina. Let's end it clean." Everett sat in his wheelchair by the window, watching the pale winter light slip across the street. His remaining leg ached the way it always did when the temperature dropped, a deep phantom reminder of years already taken. "I'm tired," Everett said, "but I'm not afraid." The voice paused, then softened. "You won't have to be." When the call ended, Everett didn't tell Mara. He didn't want her fear added to the weight he was already carrying. He pulled on his old wool coat, frayed at the cuffs, too thin for the cold, and wheeled himself out, moving slowly, deliberately, like a man stepping into a chapter he'd already read once before. He didn't see Nolan, but Nolan was already back in Briar Glen. He had returned before dawn, parking far enough away to walk the last mile on foot. No uniform, no visible gear, just a dark jacket, gloves, and the steady presence of Kestrel at his side. Nolan moved through the town like he had through villages overseas, observing without announcing, listening without inserting himself. The place felt different now, tighter, quieter in the wrong way. Kestrel felt it too. The dog's pace slowed as they approached the marina road, paws crunching softly over snow that hadn't yet been disturbed by traffic. His ears lifted, rotating slightly, sampling the air. His body stayed aligned with Nolan's, but his attention pulled forward, narrowing. Nolan didn't correct him. He trusted this silence. The maintenance lot sat between the frozen edge of the lake and a line of bare trees. Rusted equipment lay half buried under snow, forgotten by progress and memory alike. Everett was already there when Nolan spotted him. Alone, shoulders squared, hands resting on the arms of his wheelchair. 2 trucks idled nearby. No shouting, no visible weapons, which made Nolan uneasy. He stayed back watching the men emerge. 3 of them, younger than Everett, older than the boys who'd first harassed him. These were professionals in the way small-town intimidation became refined. Clean boots, neutral jackets, expressions practiced into calm authority. One stepped forward, tall, broad-shouldered, with a trimmed beard and a smile that never touched his eyes. "Mr. Calder," the man said, "thank you for coming." Everett didn't respond. Behind Nolan, Kestrel stopped. Not slowed. Stopped. His body went rigid, head angled slightly left. His paw lifted and froze mid-step. Nolan followed the line of the dog's gaze and saw it. A faint depression in the snow near the edge of the lot. Too neat. Too intentional. A trap. Kestrel took one careful step forward, then blocked Nolan's path completely, pressing his body sideways against Nolan's legs. Not aggressive, not panicked. Protective. Nolan's breath slowed. His pulse didn't spike. It settled. Everything clicked into place. The men weren't here to negotiate. They were here to provoke a mistake. Nolan stepped out of cover, hands visible, posture relaxed, but alert. "Morning," he said evenly. The bearded man turned, surprised. Recognition flashed across his face, followed by irritation. "You weren't invited." "I know," Nolan replied. "That's usually how ambushes work." Everett looked between them, confusion giving way to understanding. "You came back." Nolan didn't look at him. His focus stayed on the men, on their micro movements, on the way one shifted his weight too quickly toward the hidden snare. "This ends now," the bearded man said. "You don't belong here." Nolan nodded. "That part's already been decided." He moved. Not fast, not slow, but with intent. One step to the side, positioning himself between Everett and the trap, forcing the men to adjust their angles. Kestrel stayed locked in place, eyes tracking the man nearest the depression in the snow. "Back up," Nolan said quietly. The man laughed. "Or what?" "Or this turns into something you don't control," Nolan answered. There was a flicker of uncertainty then. Not fear, calculation. And that was when the sound of tires on ice cut through the air. A sedan slid into the lot, brakes crunching hard. Another vehicle followed. A county cruiser, lights off, but unmistakable. Deputy Aaron Mills stepped out first. He looked the same as always, average height, early 40s, uniform worn with tired professionalism. His jaw tightened as he took in the scene. Behind him came a woman Nolan hadn't met. She was in her mid-30s, bundled in a long gray coat, scarf pulled tight against the cold. Her dark hair was tied back in a low knot, loose strands framing a face sharpened by focus rather than stress. She held a camera, not raised, but ready. "Everyone freeze," Mills said, voice firm. The bearded man swore under his breath. The woman stepped forward, calm, composed. "I'm Lena Hart," she said, voice steady. "Independent journalist. Everything here is already documented." One of the men lunged, not at Nolan, but toward Everett. Kestrel reacted instantly. He didn't attack. He moved. A single explosive step, body interposing, teeth bared but not biting. The lunge stopped inches short of fur. That was enough. Mills drew his weapon, not pointing it yet, but letting the presence of consequence fill the space. "Hands where I can see them," he said. The tension collapsed inward rather than outward. No fight, no grand arrest, just men realizing the ground had shifted beneath them. Later, Nolan would feel the pain in his side. A shallow cut from a blade he hadn't seen, more insult than injury. He ignored it until Mills insisted on wrapping it. Everett was shaking, not from fear, but from release. "I thought," he began, then stopped. There were no words for the thing he'd almost lost. Kestrel stood beside him now, posture loose for the first time in days, tail low, but wagging once, slowly. The journalist took notes, asked questions, documented quietly. Mills spoke little, but when he did, it was with purpose. The trucks were searched. Evidence surfaced. Tools, restraints, falsified documents tying the men to the contractor Everett had exposed years ago. Nothing cinematic. everything damning. As the sun dipped toward the lake, Everett rested a hand on Kestrel's head. The dog didn't pull away. "Thank you," Everett said. Not to Nolan, but to the dog. Kestrel met his eyes, then looked back at Nolan, as if to say, "This part is done." Nolan exhaled for what felt like the first time all day. This wasn't justice in the way stories told it, but it was real. And sometimes, real was enough. Nothing returned to what it had been. But something closer to truth settled in. Briar Glen didn't hold a meeting. There was no apology issued by the town council, no banner hung over Main Street. Redemption arrived the way it often did in small northern towns, quietly, unevenly, through changed behavior rather than spoken regret. People began to meet Everett Calder's eyes again. Not all of them, but enough. The hardware store manager stopped by one afternoon with a thermos of coffee and an awkward silence that said more than words ever could. The marina reopened access to the old records without resistance. The whispers didn't disappear, but they lost their authority. Everett didn't celebrate. He never had. On the first morning, the snow softened into pale sunlight. He wheeled himself down the short ramp Nolan had repaired weeks earlier. The wood creaked, but held. He paused at the end, letting the sun touch his face. His shoulders relaxed in a way they hadn't for years. Dignity, he had learned, wasn't restored by declarations. It returned through permission, to exist again without explanation. Mara's life shifted too, subtly but decisively. The library sat on the quieter side of town, a low brick building with wide windows and the smell of paper and dust. Mara fit there in a way she hadn't anywhere else. She was tall and slender. With dark brown hair she wore loosely braided now, no longer pulled tight with tension. Her skin had regained color. The permanent crease between her brows softened. She shelved books methodically, spoke gently to the elderly patrons, laughed softly with children who didn't know her history and didn't need to. The job wasn't glamorous. It was honest. And for the first time in years, it didn't feel temporary. Nolan noticed all of this from a distance. He didn't insert himself back into their lives. He stayed at the edge of town, taking long walks with Kestrel along the frozen lake shore, observing the way people moved now that the pressure had lifted. He saw Mara at the library window once, sunlight catching her profile as she bent over a return cart. She looked up, sensed him somehow, and met his gaze through the glass. No wave, no smile, just recognition. That was enough. Nolan had already decided to leave. He packed early on the third morning after the marina incident. His movements were slower this time, not hesitant, just deliberate. The duffel bag lay open on the bed, half filled. The tactical jacket remained folded, untouched. Kestrel watched him, head resting on his paws. The dog's posture was different now. Not alert, not guarding, resting. That, more than anything, unsettled Nolan. For weeks, maybe longer, Kestrel had existed in a state of constant readiness. Muscles primed, ears tuned, sleep shallow. It was the condition Nolan understood best. But now, the dog slept deeply, his breathing even. His paws twitched with dreams Nolan didn't interrupt. That night, Kestrel lay down before Nolan finished packing. Fully down, on his side, exposed. Nolan froze, watching. Kestrel's eyes closed completely, not the half-lidded vigilance of a working K9, but the surrender of a creature that believed the watch had ended. Nolan sat on the edge of the bed, a strange pressure filling his chest. This wasn't exhaustion. It was resolution. Kestrel didn't wake when Nolan moved. Didn't flinch when a floorboard creaked. Didn't track imaginary threats. For the first time since Nolan had known him, the dog had let go. And Nolan understood something with quiet certainty. The mission, whatever name he gave it, was complete. He didn't leave the next morning. Not immediately. He took down the tactical jacket instead, hanging it on the hook by the door of the small rental cabin he'd been using. The fabric settled heavily, like a chapter being closed rather than discarded. Nolan still woke early, still ran the perimeter of his thoughts. But the edges were softer now. Everett noticed first. "You staying?" the old man asked one afternoon, sunlight glinting off the metal frame of his wheelchair. Nolan considered the question carefully. "I'm not running." Everett nodded. "That's different." Mara didn't ask. She came by the cabin 2 days later with a box of donated books the library didn't need. Her coat was lighter now, wool instead of heavy canvas. Her eyes were steady. "I heard you were still around," she said. "For now." She handed him the box. Their fingers brushed briefly, not charged, not symbolic, just human. "Dad says thank you," she added. In his way. Nolan smiled faintly. "I know." She hesitated, then said the only thing that mattered. "If you stay because you're hiding, don't." Nolan met her gaze. "I wouldn't." She searched his face, reading something there. Satisfied, she nodded once and turned back toward town. There was no promise made, none needed. Life resumed its rhythm, not restored, but recalibrated. Everett rolled himself out every morning, stopping to talk to neighbors who now stopped back. Mara opened the library doors and learned the names of regulars. Nolan found work repairing docks, keeping to himself, hands busy. Kestrel walked beside him, not ahead, not behind. The dog still noticed things, still paused when something felt wrong. But the difference was subtle and profound. When nothing required his attention, he let it go. One evening, Nolan sat on the cabin steps as dusk settled over the lake. Kestrel lay beside him, head on his boot. The town lights flickered on, one by one, modest and unassuming. Nolan didn't think about leaving anymore. He didn't think about staying either. For the first time in a long while, he wasn't measuring his existence by threat or response. He was simply present. Some missions ended with medals. Others ended with silence. This one ended with a dog asleep in the open, an old man in the sun, a woman unlocking a library door, and a soldier who finally understood that listening, to instinct, to restraint, to timing, was not weakness. It was faith. And Kestrel, destiny fulfilled, slept on. Sometimes miracles do not arrive as thunder or fire. They come quietly, through instinct, through timing, through a dog that refuses to move, or a man who chooses restraint over revenge. We believe God does not always speak in words. Sometimes he speaks through protection, through warning, through the unseen line that keeps someone safe when no one else is watching. In everyday life, we are given these moments too. A feeling that tells us to slow down, a hesitation that saves us, a presence that arrives exactly when we are about to give up. Faith is not always loud, but it is always precise. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that goodness still finds a way, share it with someone who may need hope today. Leave a comment and tell us where you are watching from. Subscribe to K9 Navy SEAL Legends to support stories about loyalty, courage, and quiet justice. May God watch over you and your loved ones. May he guide your steps, protect your home, and give you peace in the moments you need it most. Thank you for watching.